The Free Thinker Show. Ignite your mind, challenge the norm.
Ever wonder if we can, really control the weather?
Like, play God with the clouds.
Yeah, exactly. It always seemed like a sci-fi thing to me. But apparently people have been trying to wrangle the weather for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. Way back to, ancient rituals and rain dances and all that.
Right. But we're not talking about mystical chance here. This deep dive is about the science of weather modification, the actual attempts to control the skies. And get this. Our story starts all the way back in 1947 with a hurricane.
1947, huh? Okay, so World War II's just wrapped up, tensions with the Soviets are heating up, and somewhere in all that, someone gets the bright idea to mess with a hurricane.
That's basically it. Picture this. Hurricane off the coast of Florida, already nicknamed King by the Air Force, which should tell you something. And what do? Send in a plane full of scientists with a plan to chuck dry ice into the thing.
Oh, wow. I mean, talk about bold, right?
Right.
What were they even hoping to achieve? Just make it magically disappear?
Well, the idea, at least according to these scientists, was that the dry ice would disrupt the hurricane's structure, hopefully weakening it. This whole thing was called Project Cirrus. And it was, let's just say it didn't go exactly as planned.
I'm guessing that's a bit of an understatement. What happened? Did they accidentally create a super hurricane or something?
Okay, so super hurricane might be pushing it, but King did end up taking a pretty sharp turn after they dropped that dry ice. Instead of heading out to sea, it veered towards Savannah, Georgia, and actually gained more power along the way.
Yikes, that's not ideal. I can only imagine the public reaction to that. People must have been furious.
Oh, they were not happy. Imagine the headlines, right? Scientists accidentally steer hurricane towards land. Talk about a PR nightmare. And, in the middle of all this, you had the lead scientist, Dr. Irving Langmuir, giving interviews saying he was 99% sure they'd influence the hurricane's path.
99% sure. That's a pretty confident statement, considering, did they ever actually prove it? I mean, was it really the dry ice, or is this just a case of bad timing and even worse luck?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Despite Langmuir's certainty, the official investigation by the Weather Bureau at the time, they concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to say for sure whether the dry ice had any real impact.
So, big old question mark hanging over the whole thing. But even with all the controversy, all the outrage, this Project Cirrus, it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our attempts to control the weather.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to get into next. The legacy of Project Cirrus and what it sparked in the scientific community.
So Project Cirrus, right. It kind of stirred up a whole hornet's nest, didn't it? But it also got people thinking.
You could say that, yeah. It's like opening a door to a whole new world of possibilities and also maybe unleashing a few monsters along the way.
Exactly. And one of those doors led to something even bigger, way more ambitious, Project Storm Fury.
Storm Fury. Okay, that name sounds kind of ominous, even more so than Project Cirrus. What were they trying to do? Create a storm this time?
No, quite the opposite, actually. This time, they wanted to weaken hurricanes.
Hold on, I need to process this for a second. So first, they try to nudge a hurricane off course. It backfires spectacularly. And their next move is to try and disarm these massive storms altogether. Someone had a sense of humor about this, right?
Well, you gotta admire the, let's call it scientific courage. But they weren't just throwing ideas at the wall this time. Storm Fury ran for a good couple of decades, from the 60s to the early 80s.
Okay, so this was a serious effort then. Tell me more about how they were planning to pull this off.
They brought in a new tool for this one, silver iodide.
Silver iodide? What's that all about?
It's what's known as a cloud seeding agent. The idea is you disperse this silver iodide into the air, and it basically makes those super cooled water droplets in the clouds freeze.
So they were trying to, freeze the hurricane from the inside out? I'm picturing like a giant ice sculpture where the storm used to be.
That's a pretty awesome, but the actual process was a bit more nuanced. They aimed to seed the outer rain bands of the hurricane with the silver iodide.
The outer rain bands. Why there specifically?
The thinking was, by encouraging freezing in those outer bands, they could potentially disrupt the overall structure of the hurricane, throw it off balance, and that would, in theory at least, lead to a decrease in those incredibly dangerous wind speeds.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So not freezing the entire hurricane solid, but more like messing with its internal plumbing to take the edge off. Did it actually work? Were they able to tame these hurricane beasts?
Well, there were some promising signs. During Storm Fury, they did observe some reductions in wind speed after seeding. In some cases, they saw drops of like 10 to 30%.
Wow, that's pretty significant, right?
Mm.
10 to 30%, that could be the difference between a Category 5 disaster and something a little less, well, catastrophic.
Exactly. And this is the big but later analysis in the 1980s, they started to question those early results. They found that those wind speed reductions might have just been natural fluctuations within the hurricane itself, not necessarily a direct result of the silver iodide seeding.
So back to the drawing board then. I guess nature is a bit more complicated than we sometimes give it credit for. But here's a thought. With all this talk of tinkering with hurricanes, with potentially controlling something as powerful as the weather, you'd think there'd be like some rules about this kind of thing, right? Some kind of international weather police making sure nobody goes rogue.
You're not wrong to think that.
Yeah.
And there actually is something. Enter the National Weather Modification Policy Act of 1976.
Okay, hold up. There's an actual law specifically about modifying the weather. That's both impressive and a little bit concerning at the same time. What does it say?
In a nutshell, it says that any company that wants to get involved in any kind of weather modification activities has to notify the government at least 10 days in advance.
10 days notice. That's it. It seems like something with the potential to, affect the entire planet would come with a bit more oversight than that.
It's definitely a starting point,
Yeah.
and it shows that governments are at least aware of the potential implications of all this.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, it does make you wonder what's going on that we don't know about.
Exactly. It's like the tip of the iceberg, right? We're seeing these attempts to control the weather, but who knows what's going on behind the scenes? What kind of technology is being developed that we haven't even heard of yet? So we've gone from dry ice bombs to silver iodide, and it seems like we're still kind of fumbling around in the dark when it comes to controlling the weather.
Well, fumbling might be a bit harsh, but it's definitely true that we're dealing with incredibly complex systems here. And the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know.
That's a good point. But what about today? I mean, are there any countries or organizations that have, mastered the art of weather control? Like, is anyone out there making it rain on command or, I don't know, steering hurricanes away from major cities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are definitely claims out there, whispers of super-secret programs and weather weapons and all that. But separating fact from fiction in this field is like, well, trying to nail jelly to a wall,
Yeah, I get it. It's all very hush-hush. But let's talk about the possibilities for a second. What if we could control the weather? What kind of impact would that have on the world?
Oh, man. The implications are huge. Imagine being able to prevent droughts, stop hurricanes in their tracks, maybe even, cool down the planet a bit. But on the flip side, you've got to think about the potential for misuse, right? What if someone decides to use weather control as a weapon? Or what if, even with the best intentions, we end up messing with the delicate balance of nature in ways we can't even imagine? It's a lot of responsibility.
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. The power to control something as fundamental as the weather, it's almost godlike.
It really is. And that's why, even if the technology's out there, even if there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, we need to be having these conversations. We need to be asking the tough questions about who controls the weather and what they're doing with that power.
I completely agree. So to wrap things up, where does this leave us? We've explored the history of weather modification, from those early experiments with dry ice to the more sophisticated attempts to weaken hurricanes. And it seems like the future of this field is still very much up in the air, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. I think the biggest takeaway here is that we need to stay informed, stay curious, and keep asking questions. Because the weather, it affects all of us. And whether we're trying to control it or just understand it better, it's a force to be reckoned with.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of weather modification. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious.